Hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar titled Platforms, APIs, SDKs, Your Journey into Today's Business of IT. My name is Rihanna Collier. I'm Vice President and Managing Director of the Software and Services Division at SIIA. And we are very lucky to have Pankaj Chawla with us today. Pankaj is Managing Director for Accenture Products and Platforms. And he has extensive experience in building and selling commercial software products and disruptive IT applications. So we are really lucky to have him here today to talk about platforms, APIs, and SDKs. Before I turn it over to him, just a little bit about SIIA and why we are here today, because I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't share some of that with you. SIIA is the only global trade association representing the software and digital content industries. We were founded back in 1985, and today we serve over 750 corporate members. SIIA is made up of multiple divisions. As I mentioned, I run our Software and Services Division, which represents the ISV community as a whole, not specific to any size or vertical. But we also have other divisions. We have our EdTech group, which focuses on those companies that specifically serve the education market. Our Financial Information Services Division, which consists of those companies that hold market data. Our Connective group, which is focused on the media and information companies. And our SIIA group, which is our specialized publishers. And of course, you can see there from this slide at the core is still our public policy and our IP protection groups. Our member companies, those corporate members that I mentioned, have access to all of these divisions and the programs that they produce. Now this slide is really specific to the Software and Services Division, but could easily represent the other divisions across SIIA. These are just some of the ways to get involved with SIIA, from our communities, our events, boards, marketing and PR support, speaking opportunities, and of course webinars like the one we're on today. Now our calendar is full of activities from both a virtual standpoint and in person. This slide just gives you an idea of some of the in-person events we have in the second half of 2017. And again, you'll receive these slides, so I know the slide's a little bit difficult to read, but you will receive copies of these. As I mentioned, our memberships are corporate, so all employees can take advantage of the benefits of SIIA has to offer, and my contact details are there. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. So now on to why we're here today. I do want to give you a couple of housekeeping reminders before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and as I mentioned, the slide deck and the recording will be available after today's session. All phone lines are set on mute. We do want to be sure to take all of your questions and get them answered so please use the chat box at the bottom left of your screen to ask your questions. No need to wait till the Q&A portion of today's session. Just ask your questions as they come up throughout the presentation, and we'll be sure to address them at the end. If for some reason we do not get to your question due to time, we'll be sure to follow up offline to make sure you get a detailed answer to your question. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Pankaj, who will discuss the reasons for APIs and SDKs, the advantages, and of course building a strategy that will create business value. Pankaj, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rihanna. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to the folks online. Today I'm going to spend some time talking about platforms, APIs, and software development kits and how it's revolutionizing the IT world and also the software companies' domains of expertise. My name is Pankaj Chawla, and I'm the CTO and Managing Director for Accenture Products and Platforms. Within our group in Accenture, we are responsible for building one-to-many software products, whether it's software products, software hardware products, and platforms that is also one-to-many in nature. And also we provide product engineering service for customers who are looking to build products and platforms for their future endeavors. With that said, I'll jump right into it. Next slide, please. Okay, why platforms? I'll spend just a couple of minutes here because most of you who are on the call probably recognize the need and change in the direction that the industry is taking. But because of the consumerization of IT phenomena where people who are used to getting information and things done on their fingertips using their mobile devices expect a similar kind of behavior and ability across businesses out there, whether it's ordering a pizza or checking your bank balance or partners going and looking after their inventory and orders. Pretty much everything is expected to be at your fingertips with increased user interfaces and user experiences up to and including artificial intelligence and that type of user experience where AI becomes the new UI. And what is really powering that? Behind the scenes, I'm going to talk about the APIs. APIs is obviously stands for Application Programming Interfaces, which is a very techy term, but has become a business term. APIs expose the underlying functionality of your organization, a business use case, to the customers, to the world that wants to consume it. So it is a next level of user interface where you interact through APIs to build and consume things that you need. Under the APIs, you have what we recommend is building microservices or services that are based on very loosely coupled in architecture and infrastructure so that they're able to scale out. I'll be talking about that in a little bit. And they are also able to be very elastic because oftentimes you are exposing your services to the world that is of unknown scale and unknown user base. Behind the scenes, this is where all the magic starts to happen. Behind the scenes, organizations still have their legacy systems, still have their ERP systems, still have their custom-built solutions and systems from way back when, and the idea is to extract this data and create a layer in the middle, which is what we're calling context, and exposing that use case and data to the world. So that is what overall platform means in this architecture. Of course, it goes beyond this. It goes into the idea of standardizing your APIs so that it's industry specific. The more standards you have within the industry predefined through industry bodies, the better you can have that industry standard APIs. It also means having partnerships with businesses that can sign up and be your suppliers and vendors in addition to customers. So I'll jump into all those details and talk about platforms and then dive into what powers the platforms as APIs and what role does a software development kit play into the mix. Next slide, please. This is a diagram from Gartner where they have looked into different types of platforms in today's economy. We're going to focus a lot on the ecosystem platform, which is the front end where you see all the blue boxes. So behind the scenes, every customer of ours and every business really deals with several moving parties. Employees is one, where their own internal employees who may interact with the external customers, typically taking orders, getting customer service, et cetera, et cetera. Employees need business and information management systems. So the back-end systems of yesterday and today and will be for tomorrow is what Gartner calls information management systems platforms. So these are the back office systems that are still necessary and will continue to be so. On the left-hand side, customers, where the actual business, let's say Domino's Pizza, deals with the customers, and the customers are interacting with the organization and consuming the services. Now, the customers of today are being more and more connected through customer service. Customer service that used to be a role that's done after the sale in the past and more of a back office type operation now has become intrinsic and in the front of the customer right off the bat, and it becomes very intrinsic to the sales process. Because the thought process here is that if you are servicing the customer right at their fingertips, you're able to service them at the same time and upsell them. Behind the scenes, more and more devices are coming together, whether these are sensory devices, and these are examples. As I give you these examples, these are real examples that Accenture has with their customers. These are mining companies, oil refinery companies, car companies, all the product companies that you have seen in the past. There is a push to make all of these IoT-based, where you have sensory data, sensory devices up front, collecting information and feeding it back to the back-end platforms. And in the front, you have business partners, whether they're suppliers or vendors or even ecosystem partners who you want to expose your APIs with. So all this comes together as multiple platforms, and in the middle you have all these data, the data that's being fed and at large volumes, where you have data analytics and moving forward artificial intelligence, where you're able to do AI based on this data and predict the different areas of the business. Next slide, please. Rihanna, can we move to the next slide? Yep, thank you. So now jumping into double-clicking on this and getting into the API levels. I'm going to speak a lot about APIs. As I mentioned, these are business IT applications that are now being exposed as APIs, offered to the third-party developers or internal developers, and call from multiple devices and servers for great, fantastic front-end customer experience. So that is the ultimate goal, having the best user experience and providing that for many reasons. As I mentioned, this could be for B2B integrations, for e-commerce of the past and of tomorrow. So again, I'm going to talk about these APIs in a more technical term, but I wanted to give you a business context as to how these APIs are fueling the digital boom. When somebody says this organization is going to be digitized, essentially this is what they mean. Next slide. Please, yeah. All right, so what are the different kinds of APIs an organization has to deal with? Private APIs is something that we have done in the past, even though we called it middleware, we called it enterprise service bus. But even there, the drive more and more is to create those common data models, canonical data objects, opening up the APIs and building a layer of servers that really will be your middleware. So here, this is where you see a lot of middleware companies like TIBCO, Informatica, Boomi, Cast Iron, and others getting into the business of moving away from middleware only to providing APIs. So this is used for many reasons, but if you look at the first row here, it's mostly used to integrate internal systems in a manner that's very predictable. It's a one-to-many. It's an event subscription type architecture where you have predefined set of APIs. When you add new organizations to your existing organizations through acquisitions or mergers, these APIs come in really handy for integration. Advantages here are, of course, reduced cost, reduced complexity. The infrastructure is needed, but it's rationalized, and overall better operation. So this affects the bottom line a lot. So this is meant to improve your process and efficiency and your organizational operations. The complexity is somewhat low because you are still dealing with customers who are very internal to your organization, right? And some of the basic things you would work on is single sign-on and identity management or application authorizations. But overall, the complexity still stays low because you have known user base with known transactions that you have to work on. Then you start to expose your APIs for collaboration to external companies. Now here you have an increased sense of responsibility to build APIs and increased sense of responsibility for security and authentication, because now you're exposing your company, special data from your company to external organizations that are business partners, but yet exposing yourself to external attacks and hacks and other kinds of problems. So here you have slightly more complexity especially because of security. Also, because these APIs are consumed by your external partners, they may have their own systems that are relying on these APIs and therefore relies on these versions, and you just cannot simply change versions on them and um, make their working software buggy. So here you have a challenge of version management and deprecation and increased communication with your partners, and you start to follow more standardized principles on how you build APIs through version management and version control. A lot of A versus B testing and that kind of stuff starts to creep in. I mean, advantages here, of course, are you are starting to increase your efficiency further because of connecting your suppliers and vendors just in time. You could also start to upsell and cross-sell, and you're facilitating business-to-business type communication. In the third column here, as you get into the right-hand side, of course, the degree of complexity and openness start to increase. So here you're working with now opening up your APIs to anybody who is interested. Your APIs become your widgets that you sell. I mean, so even though Marriott hotels may be selling rooms to the customers, they may still decide to open their APIs for third parties to do whatever they want to do with it, such as Expedia to sell their rooms, or any developers to create their apps that embed Marriott's links in it. So here the idea is to publicly expose, and of course now you're talking about seriously increased security challenges, and as well as the elasticity, because now you're dealing with a very large base of unknown user sets and unknown volume. So your back-end infrastructure starts to have to be more elastic, and this is where you start to get into more containerized type of deployments, more the usage of tools like Docker and Kubernetes, where you are able to manage the scaling and elasticity, whether it's in a public cloud like Amazon or Azure or your own internal infrastructure. You do have to think in terms of software architecture that is more elastic and more containerized. Other advantages, of course, you have increased reach and traffic. The big advantage here is now you're starting to expose your business into new business models and revenue streams, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later. One example of that our customers have done is, because you now have open API, you also have all kinds of usages that create data exhaust, and therefore you have a lot more data you're sitting on, and you can do all kinds of analytics. One of our customers who was in the business of providing point of sales type solutions realized that not only there is an advantage of not creating a point of sale solution and simply creating a more dumb front end, which is a better user experience, but behind the scenes create a powerful platform that services this rich UI. So the machines got much leaner despite being better UX. But what they realize is, like, now I have all this data that I'm sitting on, such as who buys what and what is the demographics, et cetera, et cetera. So the data monetization came into play for this customer. And delegated R&D is of course another option, because now you can start to have, and this works really well with open source world, where APIs get exposed, and you have a lot more people interacting with your APIs and coming up with nice and new creative solutions that you can absorb later on. Next slide, please. Okay, I talked a little bit about, and ultimately API strategy. Really, this is an organizational strategy. It's not an IT strategy. So be careful where technical guys will come and build APIs and say, okay, here and stuff. It's good. We need to do that too, because that's how you build systems. It's best practices to do that. But really, it goes all the way up to your GM, to your managing directors, to the product managers, to folks who want to convert an organization to what it is, to more of an as-a-service organization. So ultimately, maybe I should have started there, but ultimately, our organizations as we see it, more and more people are consuming products as a service, and not even cars as a service, and not really a product. So if an organization wants to move from there to as a service organization, clearly this has to be a top-down strategy. Thought in terms of revenue and profit growth, which is a top here. block here, and then operational efficiency, which is a bottom block here. So what started out as a technical underpinning, helping us write better code, really is very critical into moving towards today's SaaS economy and as-a-service economy. And this applies to both the software companies who also have the burden of now servicing their software as a service, but also applies to regular digital enterprises who want to become more digital and get into today's digital economy. So as I mentioned, from the value perspective, you do gain new customers by exposing your services through APIs. You start to get into adjacent industries. You start to introduce new products and services. And of course, you get into data monetization type models and other new business models. On the bottom side, because of standardization, you are getting to be more efficient in your process. The assets are better utilized. And of course, there's an agility to everything you do, which is also not just an IT phenomena. It's a phenomena across all your organization. And I'll touch on that just for a couple of minutes. Because you have more as-a-service hosted instance where you are delivering your code, you have better ability to try out new business models. You have better ability to do A versus B testing of your new services. And you have better ability to be agile, and that just doesn't mean just delivering code, but it's truly being an agile organization where you're able to pivot from things that are working versus not working. And that is really, it's a result of building a API-based solutions to your problem and making them single instance. So it's one instance. All right, so the other topic that I want to touch here is third parties get paid to use. So here, as you expose your APIs, of course, you get monetization from people using your APIs to do to consume your APIs. Pretty common model. Also, the other common model is you pay your third parties to embed your services into their sites, such as YouTube model, where people embed YouTube and they get paid because of the ad revenue generated by YouTube itself. So again, expanding your reach, expanding your horizons, and expanding your new business models, all because of API-driven strategy running on a platform. Next slide, please. All right, I spoke a lot about APIs, and I'll get back to platforms here in a little bit. Let's talk a bit about software development kits. Now, what is a software development kit? It's helping your consumers of API consume it in a very, very easy fashion, and this is very powerful, especially for software development companies, the companies who are in the business of building software and making their revenue because of software. Having an SDK really makes the consumption much easier. So here's the two examples. First one has no SDK. Yes, there is an API, but you have to really spell out in your code exactly how you want to connect to it, what protocols are you going to use, and all the other mechanisms, whether it's a JSON or not, that type of interaction. On the right-hand side, if you have an SDK, you simply link your object or embed your object into your code or create a proxy and call a function, and you're done. And the underlying library of code will do all the translations for you. So really, you can get from very basic software development kit to very advanced, right? An advanced software development kit will give you a full-blown IDE, integrated development environment, whereas a basic one will give you some basic capability of how do you connect and some coding examples. The advanced one will give you probably a specialized scripting language where you can really consume the APIs quickly. The best example of that is Salesforce.com. It's a software as a service. It's in the business of providing CRM products. It provides you a full-blown language in Apex and Visual Force, and now Lightning as to how you can go about building your own sites and your own solutions while consuming their APIs. They have fully published data model. They have fully published examples of how do you run it. Clearly, it has limitations because of being a multi-tenant architecture and having all the customers run on a multi-tenant architecture. So there's governor limits, and they publish all that very clearly. It really, really makes people use that platform for developing their own customized applications much simpler. Having a strong SDK will allow your customers to extend your solution. Again, going back to Salesforce.com examples, you have lots of customers running on a single instance, but each customer can modify their own runtime instance. So Salesforce is able to upgrade their releases 3 times a year, but all the customers get upgraded together. Why? Because under the hood, they have used configuration and customizations capabilities using the software development kit, and the base software system is still singular in nature. So that is where this SDK has become very powerful, and frankly, for software companies, really will make or break your software as a service. In the middle, there are in the standard category, we think that you should also provide emulators, data transformational utilities, and how do you message in different formats. As we all know, that the devices are no longer just Windows machines running all over the place. We have all kinds of devices in different form factors, with iPads and Android devices and computers and laptops, Surfaces. I mean, having such APIs available where you can render the appropriate UI based on the form factor, running on the server side and presenting that data on the client side in a rich UI format, and having emulators and examples of that really makes you a powerful software provider versus just a basic software provider. So very important for software development companies, software companies rather, I should say. Next slide, please. The other point I want to point out here is that APIs and SDK, and I talked about organizational thinking and change in the way organization itself thinks and becomes more nimble and agile, but also for software companies, providing the APIs and SDK really is intrinsic to feature sets, right? Oftentimes we come across software companies that look at the APIs and SDK as a more of a architecture or software development activity, but in reality it's the product feature. And product management has to really get involved in building out these features. And if not, they will be very awkward for the customers to use or the developers to use. It has to be thought through as importantly as a class 1 type feature as you would any other feature in the product. So the product manager has to scope it out and determine the backlog and identify different areas where software development kit is necessary. We come across at Accenture across these 6 different categories of type of APIs and SDK that has to be provided, starting with providing customizable UI, where each customer can build out their own UI screens, but yet it's the same piece of code running in the back end. Second category of APIs that's necessary is for third-party integration. How does a software system open up? In what standards? That has to be defined by product management. Workflow and business rules and validations type features should also be presented as APIs and software development kit. Extending the data model is another category that we run into. And then SaaS enablement as well. Next slide, please. Needless to say, because of the reasons I have mentioned, all the reasons I've mentioned, not having or having an SDK has a direct impact on your profit. If you're not able to have the extension patterns, to having to avoid making changes to your core software product, you will lose the customer base. Not having configurability and customization options, not having proper documentation and solution construction aids through the examples I gave you with SDK will impact your implementation of the software product for your customers. Also, usually the companies that are software companies will start out as a tier 2 or tier 3 types of customers, providing a solutions to tier 2 or tier 3 type customers. Most software companies that are SaaS companies will go down that path. Not having an ability to go live quickly and not having the self-service options because of these small companies, really not having those large budgets to have multi-month type implementations, is also needed for, it's almost a prerequisite for multi-tenancy. And finally, needless to say, it avoids forking of code and having ability to service multiple customer code bases. This also applies to digital enterprises who are trying to go digital, right? Internally, you have to, when you build APIs for exposure, think in terms of building the software development kits so that you can have your developers that you can move around. You can also have this exposed to third-party consumers of your business services. Next slide. So here I've given the similar objectives, but with some examples of the SDK as to if the SDK scope is customizable UI. Here's all the things we should do and why, improving profitability and maintenance versus reducing time to market. A lot of these things I've already spoken in the previous slides, so I'm going to, it's just categorization of what I've spoken before. But again, the idea here is to build code that is easily maintainable, profitable, because you have base source code preventing forking, and the things that you can do to get that business objective met. Reducing time to market and implementation. I spoke about having a proper SDK, base configurations. Clearly there's a revenue source here with the software development kit, education and certification, which a lot of companies do. And of course you can license that as a separate SKU as well. And then of course you have the flexibility to meet your market demands because you can quickly pivot and provide new feature functions into your systems while enabling the ecosystem. Next slide. So getting back into platforms, I spoke about these different kinds of platforms, and then APIs and SDKs form the base. And now I'm coming back up to the platforms. Next slide. And I'll get into a little bit more types of technologies and options that are available to accomplish some of your goals. Let's go to the next slide. This one is covered into what I have spoken earlier. Okay. All right, platform deployment options. Now we get into a little bit more technology behind the scenes. Clearly, as you build your platforms, more and more companies are moving, at least more of Accenture's customers are moving away from hosting this in their own data centers to getting into much more of either a public cloud or public-private cloud, so more of a hybrid cloud. So Accenture has, clearly we have capabilities with Amazon Web Services and Azure and Google as three primary platforms. So we on the public cloud. But there are more and more newbies coming as PaaS provider, platform as a service provider, such as Bluemix and Heroku and even GE Predix. So these are new platform as a service provider. Underlying technologies is Cloud Foundry in these cases. What they have done is taken it beyond just a hosting capability, but more in terms of platform as a service capabilities, where lots of services are pre-built. So in case of Bluemix, for example, there's pre-built services around authentication, security, import-export, file management, workflow management, etc. So it helps you build your platform much faster, build your microservices much faster. On the flip side, it also locks you into their technology, which is the key objective that a lot of these vendors have, because once you get locked into Heroku, clearly you get to market much faster, but then you're also locked into Heroku. Same thing with Bluemix. So really, you have to really make that decision that is it okay for you to be locked into this, or write your code in such a way that even if you get locked into a certain vendor, you've layered your code enough that you are able to swap it out to a different vendor with some effort, but not massive effort, right? The other option you can take is maybe write it directly, at the Cloud Foundry level, where Cloud Foundry can potentially be run on multiple clouds, including your own private cloud. So if you write your code to that level, then you have slightly more portability, much like how Java, coding happens. So that would be another option with Cloud Foundry or OpenShift as two other options where you can use them to write code and be more portable. Clearly, you can also host this in your own data center. You can also install Cloud Foundry in your own data center in the private cloud. And of course, finally, you can also write things directly into Amazon Web Services, who provide a whole host of building services. Again, the advantage there is you will get there faster, but you're absolutely locked into Amazon Web Services platform. We have had customers who choose to just write code using the IaaS option, infrastructure as a service, and they have done that deliberately. And the reason for this is they want more control over everything as far as settings go, configuration settings go, and releasing the different layers of development stack, such as MySQL and others. So they completely own that versus relying on cloud providers. Finally, CAS, we're seeing more and more of container as a service options coming up, and this is because the goal is to move towards more containerized type deployments, and that is where I highly recommend you guys move and go towards as well, because this provides you the elasticity that you need. As far as data goes, we've seen customers hosting their data in the cloud, or they keep some of the proprietary and private secure data in their own cloud while keeping the rest up there. Really, there's a whole host of choices here that Accenture works with its customers on. But the good news here is that there is all these choices that are available. The bad news is it's getting more and more complex. We have seen customers really rely more and more on the open source version of these tooling, because that gives you a lot more flexibility and keeps the cost low. But our recommendation usually is that choose the open source products that have a good support structure in place, whether it's through forums, but also through some enterprise companies like Red Hat supporting Linux. The more support you have, especially in larger enterprises, the better you are, because you don't find yourself in a bind if you have a small, simple issue that you cannot be supported on. Next slide. This is a little techie slide, but what I wanted to share with you here is that we have looked at all the layers of code and deployment pieces that are necessary to build a platform. Oftentimes people think of platform as, hey, I write a piece of code, I expose that through API, and I dump it in a Cloud Foundry in a containerized manner, I'm done. But a platform, if you look at it end to end, I'll go bottom up here. What I'm showing you here is that in each layer you have all these technology choices, right? So if you look at all the way in the bottom in infrastructure, you have Amazon Web Services, Azure, VMware, Google Cloud Platform, etc. Then you go into the storage, the data, the microservices, development, the logging and monitoring. As you can see, the good news again is that there's a tremendous amount of choices out there within each layer that you can choose. A lot of them are open source, and they're fast evolving and getting mature, and that's what's booming all this innovation. So here, just keep in mind that you need all these layers of functionality that you have to account for. And there are advantages and disadvantages to doing many of these. So in the blue box, the big box in the bottom, these are all platform operations network. The top box here is our toolings that are available to you to expose your APIs to the developer portals. So rather than writing the code around building a marketplace and monetizing your APIs and keeping track of billing and subscriptions of your APIs, there are toolings available such as WSO2, which is what we have picked here. That gives you a lot of these built-in functionality for you, where you have to simply install it and work with it. On the analytics framework, clearly all this platform will generate data, like I said, and you need technologies that are necessary to analyze your data. So you have to think in terms of analytics, the business analytics as well as your platform analytics, which APIs are getting more usage versus not, which ones I can use to get A/B testing going, plus the business analytics itself in your classic BI type framework. validation framework. These are all the things that are necessary to actually quickly release new versions of your APIs and your microservices, and swap them out and do backwards compatibility testing and interoperability testing, which has become a big problem now because we are releasing things much faster, and you have unknown user base using your APIs, and you have to make sure you don't bring anybody down. So what this is that Accenture has something called Platform in a Box, where we have this overall end-to-end framework that we take to our customers and we say, hey, here's the end-to-end vision of how you can build your platform, focus on your business services as to what do you want to build from the application standpoint, and use this underlying structure to deploy and power your platform. So what you're seeing here, and the boxes you see here, are pre-stitched pieces and components that are necessary to go and build your platform. So the one you see on the right-hand side, which is application generation, is all the tooling that we have collected and worked with in a predefined manner, as well as our own proprietary tooling where you can generate code and UI and things in a much faster manner. And finally, on the right-hand side, we all are very familiar, I'm sure, with DevOps. And in today's world, if you have an instance where you're delivering code quickly in a much more rapid fashion, you have to be agile. And to be agile, you have to have a fully automated DevOps operations where you're able to do continuous integration, checking your code every night, and it runs through all hosts of battery of automation tooling, including security. And it's a releasable piece of code with every sprint. You can achieve that only when you shrink your cycles, but you're not encumbered by all the waterfall type processes that you had to do, and that can only happen if you have a lot of automation in place through DevOps. So again, this is an end-to-end platform in a box that we have that includes the DevOps pieces for our customers who are starting to put some of these together. Next slide, please. All right, so these are the other tools that we have and you can go through as things that can help you with your platform ambitions in a much quicker manner, as opposed to trying to write your code yourself anywhere. I mean, of course, this is I'm sure you guys all do this already. Build versus buy. Just buy when you get a chance. Build as little as possible because things are changing quite rapidly. And these are all the categories of work that have to be thought through during the definition phase, engineering phase, and governance phase. Next slide. Okay. So now we're getting into the last couple of slides to summarize, the critical success factors for building a platform. Start top-down. Think in terms of organization. Think in terms of strategy. Why you're doing this. It's very important to get business involved and not just make it an IT project. For software companies, think in terms of how do I move from on-prem into SaaS. If I'm already in SaaS, how do I make it more elastic and how do I make it more one-to-many? Number two, when you build your APIs, make sure they are think in terms of business use cases, business outcomes. And under the business outcomes, you may have lower level APIs that work together to manage your transactions. But make them stupid simple for your customers to use, even if those are internal customers, because someday down the road, you will get to external customers. Number three, provide developer support that's really, really good and analyze them. Who's using what, why, and what can we do better, what can we not. Without this support, I believe that especially a software company will not go very far, even though they may have the best software. We've seen decent software companies get really successful and really good software companies not be successful. It's because they have much better SDK, which is a modern version of customer service. We all know better customer service will get you there. Make services that are scalable, cloud-based, and we talked a lot about public versus private cloud. Think in terms of everything you do is in terms of elasticity, and how do you achieve that? How do you keep your architecture loosely coupled? Can you take pieces of your code and simply deploy them on a separate server farm? Keep them as stateless as possible, et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of best practices around that, right? Provide easy extension capabilities. Again, this goes back to software companies, but also internal digital IT. If you can extend the system easily by doing plugins, by doing customized screen flows, list views, drop-downs, etc., the more you can extend the system through configuration and SDK, the faster you can implement, but also less changes you have to make to your base code, and that's very important. So you can react faster, you can make it self-service, but you can also be nimble. Build a developer community around your product or your enterprise. The more you have forums and communities out there talking about you, sharing your code in an open source manner, providing you pull requests where you can bring that code back into your base, the better. This is how we're seeing companies be more successful because they are more open. I mean, this is the reason why you see companies like Microsoft even opening up all their code to open source community. And don't get into the aggregator trap where provide the services directly. Don't go through a third party. See if you can provide these services directly. That gives you the best best bang for the buck. And at least these are the best practices that we have seen work for Accenture with our customers as we build the products for our customers. These are the things that have worked, and so I'm just highlighting those things. So finally, to be clear, it's not just building an API. It's not just building a RESTful service. It is a bigger strategic thinking, end-to-end plan that's broken into more agile sprints. Next slide. Which I believe is the last slide. So where do you go from here? Is the next slide. What we do is we work with our customers, and the customers actually are not comfortable going straight to stage 3. So just like a classic maturity curve, we have things here that we have identified as things you must do to be in stage 1 versus stage 2 versus stage 3. Simple things like getting into continuous integration is part of stage 1. Make sure that you do test-driven development up front. I'm not going to read each and every bullet here. I'm sure you'll get a copy of this. So this is how we have worked with our customers in not only identifying which stage they are in, but also getting them to different stages. Because they come and ask us, how do I get to stage 1? So we say these are things you have to do, and this model works really well for us and for our customers. All right, so I'll just stop there and open this up for questions because I've spoken a lot.
No, thank you. I think that was there's certainly a lot of information here. I do want to remind the audience we do have a few questions here, but if you have any additional questions, be sure to drop them into that chat box in the bottom left of your screen, and we'll get to them. We've got a few minutes now until the top of the hour, so let me just start with, we've got a couple questions here. What are some of the best practices for versioning APIs? You have any insight there?
I'll have to take that question as a to-do and get back to that answer. There's of course practices around numbering the system, numbering them, and you have major, minor. What we do is we have major, minor, sub-minor versions, and we do that. So I'll just spew some, but there's a lot more I'm sure that we can do offline. So that's one. We number them correctly, and then we make sure that as we build new code, we have a minimal number that we're compatible with. So a 4.0 or higher. So as an example, this is something we do, and we openly communicate that to the customers. The second thing we do is when we create new versions of the code, we tend to extend and not deprecate the parameters of the APIs. So in other words, the current APIs the current calls will still work, and the new calls will break. Will also work with the new parameters. So in other words, we extend it, but don't intrinsically change the code itself. And when we do, we call that a major version, and then we communicate that publicly as it's coming and it's getting deprecated. The third is clearly building test-driven development. As soon as we develop anything, we of course have test cases that run with the continuous integration and submission of the code that will immediately flag things that are breaking. Without that automated testing in place, invariably, and we have run into that where we deliver new code and it could potentially break our customers, and it gets caught later in the cycle, let's say in the UAT or whatnot, and we want to avoid that. So what we do is we force our developers to catch that early by doing test-driven development. And then of course there's tooling in testing that we have, and I listed some on the architecture or technical choices slide that we also rely on for doing interoperability testing, so that catches the version incompatibility issues.
Great. Now, is having a marketplace for APIs a must for platforms?
No. It's for platform. Yeah. So platform, platform is an overused word. A lot of people are using platforms for everything nowadays. In our definition of platform, it's having a full-blown ecosystem where the APIs are clearly published, exposed, understood, and available for developers to work with. Marketplace is something that's not a must-have right away, but I think you should design for it, because you have to think in those terms early on, because the world is really moving in that direction. You may not have something exposed today, but you may decide to monetize it tomorrow. So you have to think in terms of the third-party authentication, subscription-based billing. How would you address that? So as you build your architecture of the system, I would think in those terms early on as opposed to later, because then you certainly have this problem of exposing this to the market and you're not ready.
Great.
And also to add to that point, SDKs also help there, right? So you have to think in terms of building the SDKs accordingly as well. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, another question. How does building platforms coincide with using a developmental methodology?
So platforms by its very definition typically are single instance, in the sense that unlike in the past where you're sending all these versions of code and keeping track of which customer has which code, platforms is running in the back end. So it's single instance, which is a huge, huge advantage given to how we used to write software in the past, right? Single version to deal with also adds a lot of burden, right? So you could potentially add code to the platform in single instance and bring down your entire customer base. So test-driven development becomes really important there. But methodology-wise, you really have to be very this provides the opportunity to do A/B testing and be nimble and add new features to your customer base. So you should take advantage of that. So the methodology really that we go with, and in fact it goes hand in hand with most of our engagements, the organization wants to be agile as well as while they build a platform. I wouldn't think of the two things as two separate things. Essentially, you should think of both of them in the same manner. And agile doesn't just mean having sprints. Agile really means that you're able to Amazon.com deploys 3,000 deployments in production per day, right? So every day they're delivering 3,000 different new pieces of code in production. So having the ability to do that, having the ability to spin up a new servers on the side and deploying the new feature there and moving customers slowly into that new server farm while the old one is still running, and if the new one is running, then turn off the old one. That's how Amazon does it. So there's a whole DevOps architecture and an agile methodology that goes with it, so that the product management and the business units and in your organization is thinking in terms of, what if I introduce this feature into the product? Let's see what happens. If it goes, then I put some more. So again, the short answer is platforms really will work better if your organization is agile.
Got it. Another last question I've got here. If anybody has any other ones, please type them in now. You actually mentioned you gave an example of Marriott earlier, and the question is, how would you classify a business such as Marriott Hotels building a platform? Because isn't it just an IT app?
Yeah, so Marriott Hotels falls into the category of what I was talking about, which is having the organizations digitizing themselves and having IT platforms. It's very different than ecosystem platforms like Uber. If you look at Uber or Expedia, these guys are in the business of, they're not in software business, but the face of their business is software. So you have platforms such as those, which we call ecosystem platforms, where you're actually carrying out trade, and there's more like exchange platforms. And then there's platforms like Marriott, which is typically in the business of renting out rooms, but they're building platforms where they are exposing this as inventory to their customers. But the two start to converge because the Marriott hotels can start exposing their APIs to do more, and then they can start to have multiple suppliers and not just be Marriott. They can have Marriott partners, and pretty soon you now become exchange platforms. So I see a world where every IT organization building a platform can become an exchange and ecosystem platform. But really most of them start and maybe stop even at the point of having everything working in a platform exposed through their apps.
Great. Well, Pankaj, I would like to thank you for your time today and for your insights. I think this has been very helpful. If anybody has any further questions, feel free to get in touch with us, and we'll make sure we get those answers. And I want to remind the audience that we will this presentation was recorded, and we will provide the recording and the slide deck. So I know there were a few questions about getting the recording and the slide deck, and yes, you absolutely will. And again, thank you, and wish everybody a good rest of their day.
Thank you all.